pray these things in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen. My name is Clement. I'm a pastor in Maryland at the Chinese Bible Church in Maryland. I've been with the youth ministry there for the last 5 years, and my parents are Dr. Yunkan Kui and Wen, who many of you know here at KRC, and my whole family is here with me. My wife Tracy is in the back, and my two kids. Ethan's 4 years old, Micah's 1 year old. It's the first time we've ever come for a speaking engagement with my whole family, with the kids as well, so it's been really neat to have that. So we start tonight. I just want to start with a quote from an email that was sent to me from someone in my church. This was an adult congregant in my church who closed a very angry email in this way. He said, "I am fed up with this self-absorbed, self-indulgent, self-diagnosing younger generation." And as someone who identifies and serves the younger generation, obviously this was something that made a deep impression on me, because unfortunately, he's not the only person in my church. He's also not the only person in this country or not the only person in this world who feels this way about the younger generation. We covered some of these kinds of statistics or some of these kinds of sentiments this morning, but I just want to review some of them with you. This guy, Mark Bauerlein, who teaches at Emory University, actually wrote an entire book called The Dumbest Generation: How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future. Or that little tagline at the bottom, "Don't trust anyone under 30" is the subtitle. So that's one example. Another example, Tim Elmore, who lives in Atlanta, wrote a book called Generation IY, which is about sort of like the second wave of the millennial generation. This is targeted specifically to those born 1990 and after. But if you notice the tagline, this is a book that is trying to say that this is our last chance to save their future. So we need to make sure we understand them. And it's a very pessimistic take on them, but it really is something where he wants to save them. That's sort of the mentality. Elmore points out that the younger generation is overwhelmed. This makes sense in our busy day and age. It's something that is happening more and more. When I was growing up in high school in Montgomery County, Maryland, I had a lot of my afternoons off. My parents probably weren't happy with that because I probably wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. But I had a lot of my afternoons off. I could hang out with my youth pastor. I could hang out with the youth group counselors. I was involved in maybe 1 or 2 extracurricular activities. And today, as a youth pastor in the same exact county, my students are taking 6 AP classes at one time. They are involved in maybe 7 or 8 or 9 extracurricular activities. One of my students got up on Saturday mornings at 6 a.m. to take clarinet lessons. And I just don't understand why they want to be so busy, but they are overwhelmed. They're over-connected. Technology plays a role in that. Social media plays a role in that. They would say they're overprotected. When we were kids growing up, we were allowed to go to the park, ride our bikes through the neighborhood, no problem. But today's kids, in Maryland recently, there was a news story of a 10-year-old boy and a 6-year-old sister walking home from the park, and basically the cops cited the parents for negligence, for allowing them to walk home from the park on their own. And if you kind of track the trends of bicycle helmets, when I was a kid, I didn't need to wear one. Today, they all need to wear one. The baby car seats, all the safety stuff for babies, it's gotten a lot more strict governmentally and regulated, and we're overprotected. And they're also overserved. Parents today serve their parents a lot more, perhaps excessively, and it has led to this. So Elmore points this out, and this is sort of his pessimistic take on how they become who they are. He also cites a study done by the Wall Street Journal and Harrison Interactive, where they went to corporate recruiters, so job recruiters, and they asked the job recruiters to describe the emerging generation. They took the results and went back to members of the millennial generation and told the millennial generation that the adult job recruiters had an E word for them, a word beginning with a letter E that described them, that characterized them, and they wanted the millennial generation to guess what that E word was. And so the millennials are very overconfident, and millennials started saying, oh, an E word. That must mean we are excellent. That must mean we are exceptional. That must mean we're entrepreneurial, that we're an exciting generation. And the result came back and they said, no, actually, the E word they had for you was the word entitled, which is something that we discussed earlier today as well. So pretty negative take, and I take it personally because, like I said this morning, I was born in 1979, and I identify being sort of on the edge of the millennial generation and Generation X. I identify a lot with the millennials. I share a lot of their sensibilities. Some people say they don't like to be labeled as the millennial generation. This is just a little history lesson for how this label even came about. ABC News at one point did a survey on what to call the next generation, and the top suggestion was millennials. The number 2 suggestion was don't label us. Sorry guys, you lost. Okay, so some people did that. So this is how that came about. ABC News' survey was the reason why millennials kind of picked up steam. I'm going to send the slides to Lily so she can distribute it to you so that you don't feel like you need to take copious notes tonight. So if you're worried about not capturing what's up here, don't worry, I'm going to have this available for you so that you can take it home with you. Okay. At this point, let me just talk about a little bit about the conversational difficulties that we have about this generation, because it is sort of ambiguous, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. First ambiguity that we have is we don't really have a hard line for when the generation actually starts. So Lily this morning, on her chart it said 1980. Some books or some writers would mark it at 1982 or 1983. David Kinnaman marks it at 1984. And what that means is this entire thing, Sloan, you mentioned this word earlier, is a social construction of America. Americans are the only ones who have titles, I think, for their generations. Boomers, Generation X, the silent generation. This is an American phenomenon. And so all the writing, all the literature for this, most of it applies to America. It applies to Canada. Of course, there are parallels elsewhere. But what I'm trying to say is it's impossible to know whether or not we are overgeneralizing with anything we say. So tonight, one of the conversational difficulties is we do not know if we are overgeneralizing on any point that I'm going to make. You just need to keep in mind this is the broadest sweep that we can possibly do to try to highlight what this generation is like so we know how to move forward. So that's one thing. The other thing we don't know is we're not sure exactly how much of what we're talking about, what we're recognizing within the millennial generation is unique to the millennial generation, or if it has more to do with the shift from modernism to postmodernism, which all of us, to varying degrees, are caught up in. All of us are in this shift together. Some of us embrace it more than others, but all of us are part of this shift, and it's hard to know where the lines are drawn. The accommodation of Christianity to postmodernism, where postmodernism now sets the terms, and postmodernism is more foundational than Christianity. That's one way that some Christians have taken this, because they believe that Christianity should be accommodated to the culture. And the third one is a faithful presence in the name of Jesus amidst the good and the bad, which ultimately confronts the principalities and powers of the spirit of the age. Okay? Out of the three, which one do you think I would want to prefer?
Third one.
Yeah, okay, this is the one that I prefer as we're interacting with the millennial generation and those who come after them. But the first one, especially within Christianity, that's actually very, very common. And I think if you have that posture, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities to minister to this group, because you're constantly going to be in defensive mode, trying to react against them, and you're not going to win a hearing from them that way. Okay, in this book, You Lost Me by David Kinnaman, Why Young Christians Are Leaving Church and Rethinking Faith. I think this is one of the best introductory resources you can pick up if you want to learn more about the generation that we're talking about. I commend it to you. It's excellent. But David Kinnaman points out that this generation we're talking about, the millennials, are discontinuously different than what has come before them. So the transition from the silent generation to the boomers, there was still more continuity there between the generations than there are between Generation X and the millennials. There's more continuity in the transition between boomers and Gen X than there are between Gen X and the millennials. And a lot of that has to do with the postmodern sensibilities we were talking about. But Kinnaman summarizes some of this discontinuity with 3 words, and I think they're helpful. He summarizes it as access, alienation, and authority. So we're going to talk about these 3 words. Right after we talk about these 3 words, if we have time, we'll talk more about the young adult exodus and the question of whether or not our versions of Christianity within our churches today are reductionist versions of Christianity, meaning they're not full-orbed, as full as they could be in terms of the gospel's intent. So the question of access. Lenny, this is where I think a lot of the cultural shifts can be attributed to, is what's called the communications revolution. And access here has to do with access to information and knowledge that's changed for the millennials versus for us. Neil Postman was a professor of media ecology at New York University before he passed away. And there's 2 sort of axioms that he talked about when it came to media technology, communications technology, that I think are very helpful for us to know, regardless of what generation we're studying. First, he noticed that technology is not additive, but it's ecological. Technology is not additive, it's ecological. And he said, technology is sort of like this. If you add a drop of red dye into a beaker of water, you don't just get clear water and a spot of red dye. The red dye eventually colors all of the water that's in the beaker. And if you were to add, for example, in America, you add the automobile to America, you don't get America plus car. You get a whole new America. You add television to America, you don't get America plus television, you have a whole new America. Do you remember when you added the cell phone into your life? You don't just get your life plus cell phone, you have a whole new life in a lot of ways, okay? And so technology is additive, not ecological. That's one principle we're going to talk about. The other principle Postman talks about is that all technology is a Faustian bargain. All technology is a Faustian bargain, meaning it's both a blessing and it's a curse. There are winners, there are losers, and there are some who are unaffected, okay? So you think about music downloads on the internet. The music industry lost. Personal lovers of music, they won, because they could get music at much cheaper, or they could borrow things from their friends, they could download it for free, they won. Me, I don't like music, so I was unaffected, okay? But we can think about other categories like this. For example, in 1450, when Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in the Western world, in the Chinese world, the printing press came out in like 1000 or something like that. But in the Western world, the printing press came out by Johann Gutenberg in 1450. And if you think about this technology not as additive but as ecological, you can understand why this communication technology democratized information and knowledge and took the power out of the hands of people who were rich enough to buy handwritten, hand-copied books at the time. The printing press has been, things like the rise of science, the rise of capitalism, the rise of modern political theory can be traced to the invention of the printing press. We can also talk about how, in terms of a Faustian bargain, when the printing press came out, the Protestants won because scripture was democratized. The Catholics lost because they were the ones who had all the power at the time. So the power shifted. And the Jewish people, they were unaffected, okay? Because they could care less about the spread of Christianity. But that was sort of the last major innovation, and it led to the rise of the modern world. You remember the dates of the paradigms that we listed earlier. 1500 to 1750 Reformation, 1750 to 1980 modern period. I'd like to lump those together because I think the printing press is what brought that about. So what brought about the shift to postmodernism? First, the invention of television, which started to change the way that we started to engage and get information. Access to information changed. And then the invention of personal computers, the internet was the big one. And then now smartphones and all of our new media devices. We are now moving from the age of the literary to the age of the digital. The printing press moved us from an oral culture to a literary culture. The inventions of modern media have moved us, I think, from a literary culture to a digital culture. And I think that this, perhaps more than anything else, is one of the major reasons for why we're moving into a postmodern era. Because again, access to information has changed. It's been democratized with the internet. And not only content this time, not only just information and knowledge, our ability to connect with each other has been democratized. You can tweet Jeremy Lin, and he might write back. You know, you can tweet celebrities now, they might write back. You can tweet Michelle Obama or President Obama, and they might tweet back. We have access to them at an unprecedented level. We have access to, so social media helps us connect. Not only now are the main curators and gatekeepers of culture the news media or the publishers, but now anyone can start a blog. Anyone can do YouTube. Anyone can contribute to Wikipedia. Microsoft was working on their newest version of Encarta when Wikipedia was coming out. Okay, and again, we're talking about Faustian bargain. Microsoft lost, Encyclopedia Britannica lost, all of those multi-volume encyclopedia makers, they lost. Who won? Wikipedia. Who's Wikipedia made by? A whole bunch of volunteers who edit it at will, and they completely took down an established industry. And it democratized not just access to the content that was written in the encyclopedia, but now people, you and I, have power to create and disseminate content and bypass all of the previous gatekeepers. So access has changed in that way. The marketplace has been democratized. Amazon.com, you can sell anything you want, used or new, and you can make money that way. Craigslist probably ruined the furniture industry. All those furniture stores are going out of sale. Furniture stores lost. You and I won because Craigslist, we can find furniture that's used for much cheaper or even free. Other things that have been democratized, things like advocating for a cause. We now have ability to crowdsource, where you can post a page and ask people to donate to any cause you want. A lot of that is tax-free and stuff like that. So, and also, dark side-wise, unfortunately, our young people today are facing more temptation in the sexual realm than any other age, probably, because pornography is just a click away. And I actually have friends who have fallen in their walk with God because they solicited prostitutes online, because that's also been democratized as well. So our young people today are growing up with a different level of access than before, and that can contribute to a lot of this. In terms of the communications revolution, I should say too, the Millennials recently, just last week actually, a study was released by the Educational Testing Service, ETS, the company that does SATs and GREs and stuff in Princeton, New Jersey. And the study found that North American millennials were the most educated in the world, some of the most educated in the world, but also the least skilled, among the least skilled in the world. So, and this makes sense with this kind of access. In math class, when I was growing up in Taiwan, you were probably learning all the inner workings of math. I wasn't. I was learning how to use a calculator. Why learn all the inner workings of math when you can rely on a calculator? Why learn how to use a compass and a map when you have a GPS? Why learn to retain information and memorize information? Memorization was the tool in the oral culture for who was smart and who was not. If you memorized a lot of proverbs, you were really wise, right? In the literary age, if you wrote a lot of books, you were really wise. In this digital age, you don't need to retain anything because Google and Wikipedia are just a click away, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you can become an expert at anything in a moment whenever you need to become one. And so access, again, has changed that way. Technology has played a big role in that. In terms of the communications revolution, there's a different set of terms that we use for how we know things versus in the modern world. In modernity, when we wanted to talk about knowledge, these were some of the words that were used. In a literary culture, reading, writing, intelligence, analysis, again, picking things apart, clarity, explanation, logic, linear sequence. Postmoderns are not linear thinkers. Postmodern ways of knowing, symbol, metaphor, experience, community, again, where our lives are an enmeshment of our community, is an enmeshment in social relationships, so we'd say community, immersed participation, the impact of the visual, atmosphere, environment, and space, imagination, intuition, sensitivity to spiritual realities. So it's a totally different way that we associate knowledge these days. And again, this is shorthand, this is a generalization, but I do think that there's some truth to what's being said here. Robert Weber concludes this chapter on paradigm shift with this paragraph. He says, in modernity, evangelical Christians have been committed to the use of verbal and analytic forms of communication to reach their generation. Faith has been explained as a system of thought characterized by inner coherence and logic. The Bible has been analyzed, theology systematized, spirituality legalized. Will the Christian faith of the modern literary world connect with the millennial generation? Do we need new wineskins? Questions, comments, challenges, George?
Does the term systematic theology have anything to do with millennial?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm so glad you asked because I forgot to talk about this. In the modern literary world, who would be seen as the authority when it comes to the highest levels of knowledge? The university. Professors. Okay. Have you noticed that the university is losing currency these days? Unless you're in the sciences. If you're in the humanities or social sciences, maybe it's a little bit better. If you're in the humanities, it's getting really hard to find jobs. Tenure tracks are low. Universities are having trouble staying funded. The former power and paragon of knowledge, the university, is on the decline. And this is really disconcerting for me, because I don't know if you guys know this, but I just got accepted into a PhD program for systematic theology at the University of Edinburgh. And systematic theology as a field is starting to shift in a way that it is now combining with historical theology. And we're realizing that you can't really do systematic without historical, because historical gives you the lens and the history of the reactions and overreactions that inform how a systematic theology came about. You can't really do systematic anymore without historical. Why? Because perhaps we're shifting towards postmodernism from objectivity to subjectivity. Well, I'm doing a PhD in systematic theology. What does that mean for my future according to this shift? Am I about to waste my life? This is something I need to wrestle with. But you have to understand, like, yeah, systematic theology, the way we're doing it is starting to shift because of some of the things we're recognizing in the broader culture. And the university's currency is on its way down. The biggest university now, the most successful university now, I think, is the University of Phoenix, with all the online programs and all that kind of thing. That's where higher education seems to be shifting. But obviously the shift hasn't been completely there yet. In the universities too, what's happening is students learn how to be academics, but they don't necessarily learn how to like be professionals, and that's a disconnect towards real life. So a lot of students just use university experience as an excuse to party, and very few, I would say, to be honest with you, I think very few college students these days graduate with a real education. I really believe that. Yeah. What's that? Unless you go to Wheaton College. Yeah. They're liberal arts still, so yeah, you're fine. Okay? But a lot of college students, I think, they just go, they have a good time, good experience, they just get the degree because the degree helps them get a job. And then there's something called the vaccination theory of education, where I took world history, therefore I got an A, therefore I've taken it, I'm now immune to it, and I need never take it again because I took that class. But if you ask me anything about world history, I would not be able to tell you a thing. Okay? This happens as well. Okay. Any other questions about shift from, communications revolution? Okay. Millennials are connected. More connected perhaps than any other generation before them. I cannot imagine what it would be like if you were in high school today, or you were in elementary school today and you started a Facebook account. You could potentially be the first generation in history who never loses touch with any of your childhood friends because of Facebook. Connected, but that connection is isolated by technology. So you're very relational, you're very connected, but at the same time you're alone in your bedroom staring at a screen to communicate and to connect. And that is an irony of this and a sign of a kind of alienation. Millennials are relational and they're very generous, but as Lily pointed out, they've scored high on narcissistic personality disorder. Lily, you had an original slide where you actually had a bar chart of it and you took it out. I don't know why, but the bar chart was off the charts. Yes. It was like boomers, Gen X, the narcissistic level was here, and then like millennials was like, yeah. Okay. And I can show you the slide. I had printed it out. If you want, you can come find me after. But they're narcissistic. They love themselves. There's many superficial acquaintances, but few close friends. Millennials have great confidence and optimism about themselves. And millennials are desiring to do great things that will change the world. However, they have trouble making long-term commitments. When you study the millennial generation, a quick survey that David Kidman pointed out was that someone a certain age in the previous generation, they would have been at the same job in their 10th year, and millennials are only in their 3rd year. And so basically millennials are staying at companies shorter times, and changing jobs more frequently. And they just, in general, have trouble making long-term commitments. And if you think about your church ministries, have any of you who are pastors in this room had trouble recruiting millennials to help you with a ministry? Especially a long-term commitment. If you do like, oh, it's only 3 weeks, maybe they do it. If you say, it's a whole year. Okay? We have a lot of trouble recruiting Sunday school teachers now at our church. We have a lot of trouble recruiting youth group counselors, and a lot of it has to do with their fear of commitment. Millennials, many grew up in non-traditional families. We're living in an age where the family structure is very different than it used to be. It's not biological father, biological mother, and 2.5 kids. It's sometimes same-sex partners. It's sometimes single mothers, single fathers. It's stepfathers, stepmothers. One of the stats that David Kinnaman pointed out in his book is that millennials are 8 times more likely than boomers to be born into the world without married parents. Think about that. And so within this non-traditional mix, and if you grew up in a traditional family, you probably know people who didn't, okay? If you're a millennial. There's a desire to connect with older generations, but rarely are such connections forged. So in our churches, a lot of the young adults, they really want to connect with the older generation, but for whatever reason, those connections just don't happen. The millennials are confident of themselves, I mentioned that earlier, but they are skeptical of institutions. They are least likely to vote. They are least likely to volunteer. They are least likely to join community groups. Part of the skepticism comes from what Sloan was talking about. The systems have failed them. They graduate from college with a 4-year degree, and there's no jobs available. They go to, church has failed them, politics has failed them, but the job one is a big one, and they're least likely to participate. For multiple reasons, the trend among millennials is to delay marriage and childbearing, if at all. And in terms of this trend, it's not always their fault. Sometimes it's just the cost of living is so high these days that they just don't feel like they could support a wife or kids or husband and kids, like family. But there are other reasons for that as well. And there's this sort of statistic called settled by 30, where Robert Withnow, I believe he's a sociologist at Harvard, Withnow will say that for the young adults, there are 5 key developmental tasks that young adults need to achieve in order to be considered a full mature adult. Okay, these are the 5 key developmental tasks that Withnow points out. Number 1, leaving home. Number 2, finishing school. 3, becoming financially independent. 4, getting married. 5, having a child. Okay? Typically, this kind of maturation, a lot of times in previous age, it was like 18 to 25. Those years are when these 5 things would happen. You notice these days it's becoming later and later for this young generation. And Withnow will say, and this is a quote from David Kinnaman's book, Robert Withnow says, in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had completed all of these tasks, had become adults by age 30. In the most recent estimate, just 46% of women and 31% of men had completed the transition by the time they reached 30 years of age. So now, settled by 30 is no longer the majority of young adults. Settled by 30 is now the minority of young adults. What does that mean for our churches? Do we need to change the way we do ministry to young adults so that we can, in some sense, meet them in this new sort of dynamic they are in? Because our ministries are not necessarily set up to meet the needs of young adults who are prolonging their development. And so the question becomes whether or not these adults have a prolonged adolescence, especially the boys. No offense to the guys here, but the boys who in their 30s are still playing video games, and girls, you know how they're just so immature. How could I marry them? You know, are they just adolescents who just happen to be 35? You know, that's a question. So the question is, do we need new wineskins for this? And one of the insights that I came across recently is in the evangelical world especially, and I think in the modern world as we've known it, most of us have grown up in it, the nuclear family has been the focus of a lot of our ministry. Healthy families are usually the ones we like to talk about. And what happens is that if someone in our church is divorced or widowed, they might not feel ministered to when a pastor goes up and gives a sermon about marriage. Or if someone is single, but they're like 55 years old, they've never been married, and the pastor goes up and gives a sermon about how to raise your kids or something, it doesn't really connect. And for young adults, when we're talking about, because we have this focus on the nuclear family, when we're preaching about how young adults need to meet people and get married and be settled and have kids, and that's sort of the ideal. And many of our young adults are not achieving that ideal in the time frame that we think they should. Is that saying that perhaps we're too focused as a church on one particular ideal that may or may not actually be biblical? Because I think the nuclear family is definitely a development of the modern world. Joseph Hellerman is a New Testament scholar at Talbot Seminary in California, at Biola University. He wrote a book a few years ago called When the Church Was a Family. And one of the things he observed was that in the ancient New Testament world, the brother-sister relationship for everyone in that culture took priority over your marriage. So if you had a biological brother or sister and something happened to them, you would leave your wife at home and go take care of them before you would take care of your wife. Okay? That's basically what Hellerman is saying. And if that's the case, when Jesus now calls us brothers and sisters in Christ because we believe in him, what he's saying is the brother-sister relationship within the church, Jesus is saying that that metaphor carries over, and our brother-sister relationship within the church carries more weight than our natural family ties. Okay? That's what Hellerman is arguing in his research. And that could easily be taken in unhealthy directions. Okay? You could easily take that in unhealthy directions. But I think there's potential there if we were to think about a new wineskins for a new generation, or in all of our generations, where all of a sudden, no matter what your family structure looks like, no matter if you're single, divorced, widowed, no matter if your family is the ideal, typical, traditional family, that you are a brother and sister in Christ, and that takes priority in terms of your identity at church over against what your family makeup is. And perhaps in that kind of setting, we'll more be able to minister to people who are not in traditional family situations, or people who are young adults who are prolonging the 5 key developmental tasks, because that is the new normal. That's what most young adults are doing now. And our church structures maybe need to change so that we can find a way to minister to them more effectively. I think also what happens is so many young adults and millennials are on their devices so much, their cell phones, their iPads. That's how they're connecting relationally. And yet, when Jesus came into this world, he came incarnate. He came embodied in the flesh. And there's this sort of sense in which the more and more we disembody our relationships, the less ideal it is in terms of how God created us. So if we were to reshift our emphasis towards the church becoming the family in a way that we prioritize the relationships, it's possible so that we would become much more incarnational and embodied in terms of our relationships with each other. And that might help with the alienation that a lot of the young adults are feeling. I'm going to stop right here and see if there's any questions about anything I just presented about alienation. But the question is, I had mentioned earlier about the addiction to pornography and how the online world makes it so much easier for people to access explicit content. And how can we help minister to people who are in that situation? Addictions are usually a sign that something else is going wrong. I think there are a couple levels that could be used. One would be just accountability and software blockers to block access to certain sites. But those things only treat the external. And so what we really need to do is find a way to treat the heart, because that's where this longing is coming from. And for different people, they're accessing that kind of material for different reasons. And so on one hand, I remember a story I heard recently is, actually it would take too long to tell, but basically we could address it at the level of just making sure they don't do it, but that doesn't necessarily address the heart issue. And we really need to figure out what they're longing for, that their hearts are broken in a certain area, that they would be longing for expression of sexuality that is not allowed. You actually gave the workshop on healthy sexuality. I actually wonder if you have something you'd like to say about this. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
no,
were talking for younger kids, but adults,
Yeah.
maybe young adults, you can't just stop.
Yeah, I think that it really comes down to how we can address the heart issue,
yeah.
and that takes a very personalized approach.
Sure.
Because Sloan said something today. He said, "All sin." This is a great quote. All sin is just a lack of love. I think, is that how you said it? And so it manifests itself in different ways. But you need to get to the core issue of what that pornography is actually trying to achieve. Yeah.
Oh, you mentioned about a church being a real family oriented environment. And I guess when people have that kind of sense of belonging, especially applying the biblical principle of the father's heart reaching to the younger people,
Yeah,
I think that would
it would help.
I hope that would help.
Yeah, hopefully that would help. Yeah. But I'm sure there are a lot of people in our churches who are wrestling with that pornography, and we just don't even talk about it. And yeah, I think even as a preacher, there are certain topics we don't always like talking about from the pulpit. Maybe we need to start talking about some of those things. But thank you for the question. I wish I could give you here's the 3 things you need to do answer, but life doesn't always work that way. So, yeah. Any other questions on this?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering about your attitude to the very pessimistic messages you just delivered to us. What's your attitude to those problems?
My attitude to it is there's probably some truth to it in terms of their description of what a lot of millennials are like. But me, I believe in the millennial generation. I believe that God is doing something with them and is going to do something through them. And I want to overlook all of that so that we can really equip them and empower them and release them to do what God has called them to do. So that's where I'm at as a pastor who works with millennials. Yeah.
Well, I just want to add on your thoughts because I think everything has 2 sides, and our generation is everything just goes to its extreme. So the technology and the social network can make tremendous damage, but they can also make tremendous good.
That's right.
Like, my experience is that with today's social networks, you can stay extremely connected with everyone.
Yep.
And I've heard that people marry two people just met online,
Yep.
and they got married and they found each other through dating website, and they're extremely matched because the website calculate their interest.
eHarmony?
Yeah, something like that. eHarmony, Match.com, OkCupid. I've tried them all before I got married. So. Well,
Yeah.
my Match.com is my brother. Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yes.
See, family connections, that's good.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's why Neil Postman's going to say technology is a Faustian bargain.
Yeah.
There's winners, losers, someone affected. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time. And every technology is like that. We were talking earlier today about when new time-saving technologies come out, like the microwave, all of a sudden, someone who's cooking at home doesn't need to spend 5 hours cooking anymore. You just pop their dinner in the microwave. But what the trend has been with time-saving technologies is that we buy the time-saving technology, and then with the time we've now saved, we commit ourselves to things that take even more time than what the time saved would have been, which is why we're constantly now becoming more and more overwhelmed. That's one explanation for how technology has sped our life up when it's supposed to save our time. So yeah, technology is a Faustian bargain. It's blessing and a curse. It's good and it's bad. Winners, losers, someone affected.
Yeah. Because I'm a study media, and media requires many different types of technologies.
Yeah.
It's like a combination of everything.
Yeah.
I think that it's just my suggestions. I think because I have so many options, and what myself really want is a place that can teach me how to choose wisely.
Yes.
And I think that could be the new direction for church.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk later. Kinnaman's going to say one of the reasons for why there's a young adult exodus in the church is because they feel that the church, I think the word was restrictive or something, where it's like movies are bad, gambling is bad, smoking is bad, alcohol is bad. And Kinnaman is going to say, what we really need to teach instead is discernment. Rather than, media is bad, run for your life, or I didn't hear anything, did you? Media. Right? It's choosing wisely with media is what we're going to need to teach the new generation. So to try to make it not this extreme, it's about discernment. Yeah. I need to move on, but yeah, one more question back there.
I'm interested in when you're saying the settled study.
Yeah.
Since the 5 criteria is so hard to meet at 30 now, do we have a new definition?
Again, we're in descriptive mode, not in prescriptive mode. And those 5 key developmental tasks are arbitrary. Someone just said that these are the markers, and they just said that's the standard, but it's someone's interpretation. So I think there's room for us to explore, and I think that's why I'm saying if that's the new normal, we as a church need to be able to accommodate for that and really minister to young adults who are at that stage where life has been delayed compared with previous generations. But as far as I know right now, there's no new standard or anything. It's just an observation. And I think the new standard is going to come after all of the millennials have gone through a phase where we can now calculate something new. That hasn't happened yet. So, yeah, you can help set the new standard. Think about that.
40 years, because childbearing women reach 40. After 40, it's very hard to give.
Settled by 40. The wisdom of Professor Wynn. Let's talk really quickly about authority. I said earlier, authority structures are unsettled by the access thing, where the Pope lost all the power and the scriptures were democratized. And millennials today do not have the same respect for the authorities that we maybe respected when we were younger, or some of us still do. Kinnaman's going to go down that road. I want to go down a different road and talk about authority in a different way, especially in our church settings. Millennials, postmoderns, they've grown up in a world where they have a lot of say, they have a lot of voice over a lot of things in their life. And then they come to church and they are shut down because the leadership meets in a room that no one else is allowed to go in. And being young and needing to respect their elders, they're not usually given a place at the table. And what happens is millennials who are so used to participating and owning decisions everywhere else they go. Within the church, they feel disempowered, and then they feel discouraged, and then even if they stay, they kind of have a sour attitude about it, and they don't feel like engaging in anything significantly or meaningfully. And perhaps with that sensibility, I believe the next generation's churches are going to be much more open in terms of leadership, are going to be much more participatory, where everyone in the congregation owns the decisions together, and where it's not just in the closed room with the elders or the deacons, but it's really the congregation owning it. One way I've heard this said is I have a pastor friend in Vancouver who took on a new English congregation, and he said to the congregation his first weekend there, he said, "I'm not here to make changes to you. I'm here to make changes with you." And that kind of posture, I think, might be a new wineskin we can consider on the authority question. Let me stop right there and see if there's any questions. Actually, Jonathan, Sloan, do you want to comment on that at all? Do you sense the same thing?
Totally.
Sloan has spoken. Okay, just kidding. Go ahead. And if you questioned any of the central tenets of the faith, even if they were honest questions, they sort of felt shunned, and because of that, they felt the church's doubtless posture was alienating to them.
What is exclusive?
Exclusive means certain people are in, certain people are out. So it would just be something, I'd have to look exactly at what Kinnaman's talking about, but it's basically the idea that we exclude certain people and we include certain people. I think perhaps the attitude towards homosexuals perhaps alienates some, because we exclude homosexuals, we exclude Muslims. That perhaps happens.
Single parents.
Single parents perhaps feel excluded from the life of the church. So there's different lines there of what that might look like. Okay, there was a national study of youth and religion that took place in the 2000s by Christian Smith and some of his colleagues. And these are 3 books that resulted. This first book is called Soul Searching. That was about the American teenagers when they were younger, and they did follow-up surveys with those teenagers as they became young adults, and that book became Souls in Transition, all the way on the right. And in the middle is a book called Almost Christians, which was based on the same research that Christian Smith used to write Soul Searching. And I highlight these for you because this is perhaps the most comprehensive study of American millennials that we have so far. What they found was, first of all, parents played a very important role. Whatever the teenager's faith looked like would usually mirror whatever their parents' faith looked like. So if your parents were really, really strong in their faith and did devotions all the time, and your kids could see that, lived a Christian life at home, a lot of times the kids would pick that up. But if your parents had a casual relationship with the church, that the teenagers would come away with a casual relationship with the church as well. So the role of parents was especially important. And they could say, however the parents go, that's usually how the teen would follow. And some of us were thinking to ourselves, my teen wasn't like that. I'm so devoted, and my kid is a total wreck when it comes to faith. And there's some research that suggests that teenagers will go through a rebellious period of time, but then will rubber band back to whatever the parents were like. And so the parents were a very strong predictor of what that person, the young person, would eventually become. That was one finding from the study. The other finding, though, that is unfortunate, if you think the role of parents is that important, but the parents themselves did not have a healthy understanding of Christian faith, then that would be a problem. And what they found was that the majority of teenagers and young adults later on held to something called moral therapeutic deism. This is the term they gave to this phenomenon that they observed as they interviewed all of the participants in the study. MTD was defined as 5 things. This is the common faith of many of our teenagers and young adults who grew up in church. And for some reason, this is the faith that our church has given them. And their parents, again, were the predictor of them having this. Number 1, a God exists who created and orders the world and watches over life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God is not involved in my life except when I need God to resolve a problem. Number 5, good people go to heaven when they die. Okay? Unfortunately, this is what our churches have transferred to the younger generation and what parents have modeled to them. Because this is what the study found, is that most of the teenagers they studied, no matter what faith background they had, this was sort of a standard that they found that was common to them. So Drew Deek, writing about this, is writing about the people who leave church. And he says, what pushes them out? Again, the reasons for departing in each case were unique. But I realized that most leavers had been exposed to a superficial form of Christianity that effectively inoculated them against authentic faith, that effectively worked as a vaccine against real Christian faith. Okay? Let me read that again. What pushed them out? Again, for the reasons for departing in each case were unique, but I realized that most leavers had been exposed to a superficial form of Christianity that effectively inoculated them against authentic faith. And that really makes me wonder, and I hope it makes you wonder, whether our faith and what we're passing on to our millennial teens and young adults is the fullest kind of Christianity that we can give them. Or is it a reductionist, superficial form? Will they return? Previous generations, they say, Once they left, they would have their own families, and then they would want their kids to have a moral upbringing, so then that was when they would come back. But some people today are more skeptical that the current millennials will do that because they're spending much longer in that delayed marriage state. So say when you were in an earlier generation and you left church, but then 3 years later you got married, and then a year later you had a kid. You were away from church for 3 or 4 years, you come back. But let's say now you leave church, and then 12 years later is when you get married and have kids. You've now had way more time outside of church for identity formation, etc. Perhaps you're not going to come back. So that's one of the concerns. So the previous generation's argument, we're not sure if that's going to hold. The role of parents argument, as Mark DeVries, I said this earlier, what they've noticed is that teens or young adults will go through a rebellious era, and then they will rubber band back to whatever their parents believed. But the problem is, again, what if their parents believed in moral therapeutic deism? And that's what they rubber band back to. Or what if, what we talked about this morning, what if they believe in something I think is a reduced form of Christian faith called salvationism, where the only thing we care about is personal salvation and making sure that other people are saved? Is that the fullest understanding of the gospel that really exists? And that is what I think this might be a caricature, but the old wineskins of the evangelical world of salvationism maybe needs to be addressed. What I personally noticed is that my own experience growing up in the evangelical world, and even as I look at my own sermons that I've preached over the last 5 years at my church, they're focused on mostly these things. Number one, personal salvation and evangelism. Number two, personal relationship with God and devotions. Number three, personal morality. And under that, there's two categories: virtues like loving other people and avoiding and repenting of personal sin. Some sins emphasized more than others. So for example, gluttony in our evangelical churches, not usually addressed. Premarital sex, addressed a lot. Okay? So we're selective about which sins are more major than others, but that's the emphasis upon personal relationship, personal salvation is very pronounced, at least in my experience of evangelical faith. David Bebbington, a British historian who's now at Baylor University, I think this sort of corresponds with what I just said, okay? He believes there's 4 key ingredients of evangelicalism throughout history that he's pinpointed. Number one, conversionism, which is the crisis moment where someone makes a decision for Christ. Number two, biblicism, a very strong relationship to the Bible. Number three, activism, but by activism what he means is sharing the faith, not necessarily like social justice. And number four, crucicentrism, which is an emphasis on the cross and the redemptive work of Christ on the cross. And I think when we think about Jesus, we typically think about God. Sometimes we shorthand our definition of God by calling God creator, redeemer, and sustainer. Typically, we associate the Father with creator, we associate Jesus with redeemer, we associate the Holy Spirit with sustainer. But Jesus is actually involved in all of these activities, and the Holy Spirit is as well. That creation, redeeming, and sustaining is a Trinitarian work through and through. And so when Jesus is named as the Word who became flesh in John chapter 1, it also says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him, all things were created. There was nothing that was made that didn't come through him. Jesus plays a very big role in creator. Hebrews says that Jesus is sustaining all of creation by the power of his Word. But in evangelicalism, and this is a caricature, I realize, but many of us, we overemphasize Redeemer to the neglect of his continual creating work, his continual sustaining work. And what that means is perhaps we have an incomplete understanding of Christ and what he's done for us. Especially as we transfer our faith to the young generation, perhaps we are overemphasizing his role as Redeemer in terms of our salvation. So new wineskins, perhaps for evangelicalism, I talked about this morning, recovering the cosmic vision, which is the all-encompassing vision of creation being reconciled to God, and how that affects our understanding of how we practice church and be missional as the church. Colossians 1 anchors this for me. This is just one passage I can give you, but I can make a full argument another time. I'm just going to name this argument. Colossians 1, Paul writes this: Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. But there's this cosmic vision for Christianity where everything in creation is reconciled to God, not just us as persons, as individual persons. Oscar Kuhlman, I think, is where this comes from. When he's tracing the entire story of Scripture, this is how he sees it. He sees that God created all things, everything in creation created by God. Then he created humanity, okay? Human beings. Out of humanity, he picked one family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to be his chosen people who would eventually bless the entire world. Within Israel, the chosen family, he chose one line, David's line, that would eventually lead to Jesus Christ, the chosen one who died on a cross to reconcile all things to God and to reconcile all of us to each other and reconcile us with ourselves, forgiving us of our sins. Jesus Christ then went to the Jews. Who are the Jews? Israel. Same. Jews then cascaded out in Acts to the Gentiles. Who are the Gentiles? Humanity. And I think where we are in the story now is that God is reconciling all things to himself. In fact, that is the vision of Revelation 21, that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, a renewed heaven and a renewed earth, where all of creation is saved by God, reconciled to God. So, if we've overemphasized Redeemer, perhaps what we need to do is, again, not be crucicentric, but Christocentric. Focus on the person and work of Jesus Christ in its totality. And other shorthand ways in which we can talk about Jesus is creator, redeemer, sustainer, prophet, priest, and king. And if we have this fuller vision of who Jesus was, and our ultimate call is to image Christ and be more and more like Christ, everything we do in this life, I think, can connect to something on this chart. Leadership at work, does that sound like king? You know, priest, does that sound like being a doctor or a lawyer? If you're an accountant, does that perhaps something you're due to sustain? If you're a cook or a chef, is that sustaining people? Recreation, sustaining people? If you're an artist, are you imaging God in his creative work? Everything we do in our lives finds connection with what God is doing. And this is something that is really needed because millennials who have been taught that Jesus is just Savior, they're having trouble connecting their faith with their actual life. And they don't necessarily see how their life is perhaps part of their divine vocation, a God-given calling. And the more we can help connect young adults to God's divine calling on their lives, the more we'll be able to minister to them, and the more they'll be able to see that church and faith are relevant. So reclaiming the cosmic vision is important and is part of Jesus' mission and ministry in the world. Another question I think we need to ask, sorry, I just want to see if I can get this in. Okay. Dallas Willard. He's a philosopher at USC. He passed away recently. What he noticed was that one of the questions that we don't often ask is the question of what it means to be a human being. In our universities, he says that we have systematically set things up so that we answer questions like how to do business, how to do law, how to do journalism, but systematically, at least at the University of Southern California, we're not answering questions like, what is law? What is business? What is journalism? We don't ask the question of the inherent nature of things. And one of the most important questions that Dallas World believes we're not answering is the question of what does it mean to be a human person? What does it mean to be a human being? If we think about all of these ethical issues that this generation is considering right now, issues in sexuality and gender identity, issues with bioethics and biotechnology, issues with economics and social justice, issues with racism, ethnic and culture, how that fits in to being a human being, issues of worldview and diverse religions, how that fits into being a human being. I think the question that as a church we need to begin to think about more and more and help millennials think about more and more is the question of what it means to be a human being. And I'm not sure our churches have done that. So actually there's 4 questions I think would be helpful for our churches to reconsider. And Daryl Johnson, he was my preaching professor at Regent College, he says whenever he visits a church, he asks himself 4 questions about the church he's visiting. And if he can answer these 4 questions about the church, he'll know how healthy the church is. These are the 4 questions. And as we apply to millennials, then we can say, how can our church answer these questions better? Or answer them at all so that we can give a fuller faith to our people. Number 1, who does this church believe Jesus is? So I say this because if Jesus is just the salvationism kind of metaphor, then we might not be capturing the fullness of what Jesus is really all about and all encompassing in the gospel and his mission and ministry. But who does this church believe Jesus is? Number 2, what does this church believe it means to be a human being or a human person? Number 3, what does this church believe about the process of maturation, growth, and discipleship? How many of our churches actually have a plan for how we're going to disciple people in our church? A lot of our churches do not have a process for this that's been thought out and prayed through. And when we get a lot of baby believers, a lot of us don't know how to handle them. And finally, 4, how does this church make decisions? And that goes back to the open leadership model. But again, how the church makes decisions could be a sign of health or unhealth. One more book for you guys. You guys have done a great job this weekend. I think this is actually happening. Book by Earl Krupp's called Reverse Mentoring: How Young Leaders Can Transform the Church and Why We Should Let Them. I'll put that plug in. But that's happening this weekend. Let me see if you guys have any questions about anything in the presentation, and then we'll close for the night. I'm basically done. Yeah. Questions, comments, concerns, challenges? Go for it. Yeah, Mike.
Do you see, or is that like that book? Is that a new church run by millennials, and they are successful? That we can look at the model.
Oh no. This is more just trying to give old generation leaders some reasons for why they might want to consider the voice of the younger people, and then work with them and partner with them in a deeper way than what's happening right now. So the term is called reverse mentoring. I think it's a useful term, but I also think mentoring is also necessary. Like forward mentoring is also necessary. But it is just a cry to help church. I think one of the chapters is like, I'm not cool. And the young generation helps me know that, you know? And the young generation can teach me what it means to be cool. Stuff like that. But it's deeper than that, obviously. But just trying to help older leaders find a way to give the younger generation a voice. I think that's going to be necessary. The reason why I'm harping on this participatory open model is because, you know, a lot of times our church leaders, when they're getting older and they're about to retire, what they try to do is they try to set everything up and then hand it over to the younger generation, and the instruction is, I've set everything up for you, don't screw it up. Okay? Instead, we need to realize that the fact of the matter is we're not going to live through the next era. The people who need to make the decisions about the future of the church need to be the people who are going to live through it. And I think that's why I think we need to start mentoring and also raising these leaders, but also giving them a voice in a way that they participate in meaningful, significant ways, so we can actually hand it off in a way that they are empowered and they're not just in this don't screw it up mode. Yeah. It's been a long night. Sorry. But yeah, hopefully this is helpful. Any other questions, comments, challenges, concerns? Okay. Let me close us in prayer. And I'll be around if people want to talk. I'll be around for a few minutes.
Wait, I have a
Oh, yeah.
question.
Go for it.
Still, what's your answer to this?
Sunday sermon.
My answer, no, it's not this Sunday sermon. My answer is, I think these are questions that churches need to work through. Because if you can answer these 4 questions, see, it doesn't really matter what I believe about this. Because your church, I'm not the pastor of your church, okay? The question is, what do our churches believe about these things? Because if you can answer these 4 questions, you could write books about the theology that's underlying the church there, that's functioning there. It doesn't matter what the church says in their statement of faith. What Darrell Johnson's looking for is the underlying functional operating theology that's informing everything they do. So it doesn't matter what they actually say, it matters more what they do. And how they do this stuff, if it can be healthy or unhealthy. Unfortunately, if I try to answer anything right now, it's just going to be really superficial and not very developed, which is why my point is just to leave the questions with you to wrestle with.
But do you have an answer to your own?
I have some inklings of what I would say, but there are some questions. For example, who does this church believe Jesus is? I definitely would say he's got to be more than just the make disciples who make disciples Jesus. He's got to be the Jesus where everything in all of creation finds its end in him. Okay? So that's something I would say. Not all churches operate that way. Okay? What does this church believe it means to be a human being or person? To be honest with you, I'm still working through that question, because that's a very complicated question and involves so many variables and so many dimensions. What does this church believe about the process of maturation, growth, and discipleship? That's a question that I think our church has struggled to answer, to be honest with you. And I think for me, that's a question I need to think more about. And then how does this church make decisions? I've already said participatory open leadership is what I would prefer. That's not the reality in a lot of our churches. Fortunately, I'm still in process and still working through this. I got these questions from someone else, but I think they're very good. Yeah, so I'm sorry about that. It's time to start working through these questions. That's the point, is millennials